Many times when we hear or listen to one of the parables of Christ, it is difficult to see its connection to our lives, our contemporary society. This one, though, seems to be strikingly, uncomfortably relevant. It's as fresh as last week's headlines and as current as today's readings. It really is about violence, isn't it? About the violence perpetrated on some innocent ones whose lives are taken, snatched away for no reason at all. Violence is the words written across the page, not only of this text, but of our experience in life. And the word I want to, or the phrase I want to focus on, is really right after the events of the taking and the killing of the son. For the gospel writer poses a question. Now, what do you suppose that owner will do to those? That's a good question for us. Now, what do you suppose the owner will do to those? Now, we may think of ourselves as nonviolent. We don't perhaps use any force or fear or any way in which we would be deemed violent people. And yet, when you think about some of the words we use against one another, they are harsh, stinging, and critical. Often they are even abusive. They are words that rob someone of their own inner dignity. Even in our bullying of others, we take away from them the very gift that God gave them. They are the daughter, the son of God, and yet our words would seem to put that away, forget about it, diminish it. We are violent with those words, no less than if we had used weapons of violence. Now, what do you suppose the owner will do to those? Or perhaps it is our violence is not words, but behaviors. We may not use any fists or any guns or weapons again, but I will use it as I look at others as objects, those who are there to accede to my demands, to listen to my commands, to be objects of my pleasure or my intent. I don't see them as individuals. I don't treat them as those given gifts and blessings, purpose, and meaning by God. No, not at all. They are only there for me. I become controlling in my ways. I will get them to do what I want by conniving or making them feel guilty or in some way beholding to me. I use my behaviors to control them, to diminish them. They too are violent behaviors. Now, what do you suppose the owner of the vineyard will do to those? Or maybe it is I am like those tenants in that vineyard. Remember, we're told the vineyard is owned by someone else. This is given to them for a time. It is not their possession. You and I often have reflected on how blessed we are. We have been given perhaps good roots in the families that gave us life, good beginnings by those who loved us or offered us faith. We have been given many blessings, and we have received bounty from those who went before us in the gifts of buildings and places, institutions and learnings. None of those I earned. They were gifts given to me. I may have enriched them and built upon them, but they were initially and in their foundation gifts. But I have treated them as possessions, so I am stingy with giving them back. I don't offer them very freely to those who might need them. I may even make them ask before I offer and say, no, I can do this for you. I can offer you this. My insight, my understanding, my compassion, my forgiveness. I can offer all those, but I often withhold them, and I make you earn them. And even worse sometimes, when I lose one or two of the other gifts I had for a time, and I see you with those gifts, holding them, I become resentful, even angry at God. Why do they have it and I don't? Why did you give them this and I don't have that? Now, what do you suppose the owner will do to those? And then sometimes it is, I have forgotten that that very word of God is meant to change me. You see, the owner of the vineyard sent several of his servants, and then finally his son. He gave them multiple opportunities to change. I've heard the word of God many times, and I've heard that call or felt that tug to change, but I've not done it. A change to turn away from an old behavior, an old sin, a fault, a failure, and I resist it. Or maybe the call to change in a way of enlarging, enriching, and beginning a new pathway of the Lord, beginning a new behavior in the Lord. And even that I have resisted, unwilling to change, unwilling to hear the word of God as it calls me to something new, something better, away from something old and destructive. Now, what do you suppose the owner of the vineyard will do with those? And then finally, maybe I see myself, or I felt myself, to be more like that servant, maybe like even the son, sent in the midst of these violent people. I have gone to bring only good news. I have done only what God asked of me. I didn't do anything wrong, and yet what I received was hatred, vindictiveness, and violence. I was innocent in this, and I can become something I should not. It reminded me of a story written in America magazine a while ago about a nun, a religious woman. She had been going from her work, she was a nurse, back to her convent. She was driving, and then there were some teenage boys who had robbed a convenience store, and they were racing away to flee, and they smashed into her car. She was not critically injured, but she was severely injured, enough to spend several weeks in the hospital, and unfortunately was still limping and would probably limp the rest of her life because of the injury. The boys, because they were underage, were given not an adult sentence, but a rather light one, about a year and a half in a juvenile detention facility. The nun was angry, of course, at the violence perpetrated on her as the innocent victim, and she decided what she needed to do was to go and visit these two young men in the detention center and express to them her forgiveness. So she arranged that. She met the two of them in the facility, and they sat across from her. She went through a great deal of detail, telling them of her pain and the week she spent in the hospital, of how she was not able to do her work as the nurse, how she was deprived of her living. And then she paused and she said, "But I want to forgive you for what you've done." The two young boys across from her said, "We don't need your forgiveness." They got up and left. She wrote in the article she was more angry that day than when they hit her car. She said, "I had to fight back the resentment. I had to fight back that retaliation. I wanted to be as hurtful to them as they were to me." And then she cited this gospel and said, "But what does violence in a cycle accomplish? I didn't want to continue the violence. I didn't want to contribute to more hatred in the world. So I began my journey to freedom for me, the journey of letting go, not the journey of resentment, not the journey of vengeance, but the journey of forgiveness, of letting go." Now, what do you suppose the owner of the vineyard will do to those? You see, that's what's rich about this gospel. It really calls us to say, yes, I know you live in the midst of a violent world, but it does not mean you have to be violent. And look at the ways in which perhaps we are. Look at the words or the behaviors that rob others of their very dignity. Or look at the ways I have not shown compassion or empathy, and how I have used my possessions as if they were mine and not just gifts to be shared. I, after all, should be that servant like Christ, like the Son, not with words of retaliation or vengeance, but seeking words of peace. They are difficult in a violent world, but they are the call. For after all, what do you think the owner of the vineyard will do to the others?